I'm really excited about tonight and what we're getting ready to start on this journey, lessons in African American history. As I've been mentioning over the last several weeks, this is something that I have wanted to do for years. And this is going to be a great opportunity for us to come. I particularly intentionally want to do what we're doing here from the church because I believe this is a topic as a church that we have to engage. And I believe we have to engage it for a couple of reasons. We have to engage it because I believe the church should have something to say about every issue or challenge that our country faces, or our world faces for that matter. We're in a very interesting time today where history is seen as an affront, if you will, and is being called everything other than what it really is. And so I do challenge us, one, to know our history, and two, to challenge others to know it as well. A lot of people, I've heard it said, it's true that African American history is American history, and it is because we are a part of that larger history. So when we talk about African American history, and it is a part of American history, and when I teach it, it will intertwine with American history. A couple places that we're going to begin today that will be a little bit, I won't say interesting. I believe we have to start our history where we're about to start it today, because our history, African American history, does not start in America. African American history starts in Africa, where we all began. Our history, all of our history began there. I would argue all of our history, all of the world's history began there. And so I will challenge us, each of us, to really take a look at that history. I'm going to, as we go through this history, I'm going to give you books and articles and different things. I will cite various sources that we will be using throughout the course. Quite honestly, I don't know when this course will end. If I get my way, I'll teach it every Monday from now on, because I believe it is that important. And I will connect it to various challenges that we face even today. I believe a lot of the challenges we face in our communities is because we struggle with our history. We've been taught in many ways, in Malcolm X, when we get to the 60s and we start talking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the incredible contributions they made much later in this study, Malcolm X talked about the challenges that we face because of how we see ourselves. And I truly believe that if we really get a handle on our history, that we will see how incredibly proud we should be in that history. And I believe our children, as they understand our history. Speaking of children, I need Chase, and if you can hear me, I need you in the sanctuary with me. I need you in the sanctuary with me. The whole purpose of you being here is to be here to hear this lesson as well, because our children must know that history, and it's up to us to teach that history. And so we've got to know it in order to teach it. And so we've got to know it in order to teach it. And so with that being said, we're going to begin this lesson on the continent of Africa, because in order to understand what we're moving into when we get to this country, there are going to be several things that you will have to grapple with. I'm excited about those things because what you're going to find is history is incredibly nuanced. It's hard to teach history because if you're going to teach it in its totality, you would quite honestly, the classes would never end. So for those who've been to college, what you'll see, you'll get a survey course on American history, but if you look at the course offerings in every college, you'll have an opportunity to take courses that will deal with certain subjects in more detail. That in order to teach a course in African American history, a survey course, if you will, in American history, in African American history, in European history, in African history, any larger history like that, you can only teach in small bits and pieces. You want to teach a trajectory of how to understand history in its larger context. And then the hope is that as you're going through those courses, there's certain things that pique your interest, and then you're able to take that more specific course. So when I was taking courses on American history, one of the courses when I was teaching, quite honestly, at the University of Michigan as a graduate student instructor, there was a course that you could take on American wars. Now, an American history course would have to deal with all of the wars in the history of America, but you wouldn't be able to go into much detail. So if you wanted to go into detail, you could take a course on American wars. For example, in African American history, we could take a course on the whole span of African American history, from the shores of Africa to, say, 1865, then 1865 to the present. But you could take a course specifically on slavery. You could take a course specifically on the civil rights movement. And so different topics that would pique your interest, you could go into more detail. So the challenge that I have is to teach this course in a way that it has a trajectory, but this course is going to be longer than any 13-week course of a semester, because I want to teach some of the nuances that you would get if you were taking this larger course, but with some specificity at different points. So I will begin this course on the shores of Africa, on the continent of Africa. And then as we're going through this course, and particularly as we start dealing with slavery in America, I will talk about some things in our culture and slavery that came across from the shores of Africa with us and influenced this country as well. I'll talk about some debates that are out there where there's some people who would argue that the institution of slavery was so traumatic that every vestige of Africa was lost on the Middle Passage. There are others that would go through painstaking detail to demonstrate and to show there were Africanisms that came over to this continent with us. And you'll see them in music, you'll see them in language, you'll see them in food, you'll see them in a lot of cultural connections, and I'll talk about some of those as well. But in order to understand that, we'll have to start on the continent of Africa. Allow me to say this because I need to make a couple arguments here early, and I will probably push on some of these as we go through this study as well, because I want to first make it clear on this stage and in this study that African American history is not critical race theory. African American history is not critical race theory. Let me just talk a little bit about critical race theory for those who are out there who need to hear it, because there's a lot of things going on in certain realms of our community and in our country where people are trying to conflate African American history and critical race theory. Critical race theory is a thing. It is not, however, African American history. Critical race theory is a legal theory. It is a legal theory that in every instance up until now has always been understood to be taught at the college level. I would never heard of critical race theory until I got to college. Some of my favorite writers are critical race theorists. I'll give you an instance of one. His name is Derek Bell, passed away a few years ago. I had the privilege of meeting him my senior year of college at Morehouse. He came and did a lecture there, the Benjamin Mays lecture of my senior year. Wrote a book, several books, but one of his most famous books was called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, subtitled The Permanence of Racism. And what his book was attempting to do, and what most critical race theorists are attempting to do, is looking at race in this country and the challenges that our country has had with the issue of race, and looking at out of the box ways of addressing challenges that the traditional ways of attempting to address them have not adequately addressed. That's why it is a theory. It's critical race theory, but it is not African-American history. Unfortunately, people are attempting to conflate them and are using it to look for ways to attack African-American history. And so I believe there are some challenges, even with some of the curriculum that's out there as it relates to African-American history, because everything that is attempting to be infused into it isn't African-American history either. And I do believe that there are some political agendas out there on both sides. However, I'm not here for any of that. I'm here to help us to understand our history. Allow me to say something else on the front end of this. That when you look at the things that African-American people have endured, and to see that in the midst of all of the things that we have had to endure, and I'm gonna talk about some of those things that began on the continent of Africa through the introduction of the slave trade, that quite honestly is much earlier than we've been taught. In America, when we talk about African-American history, you'll hear the year 1619. I'm gonna take you back to the year 1502, 117 years earlier, when you start seeing the trafficking of African people around the world, not just in America. As a matter of fact, America is not the country with the smallest number of slaves, but there are countries that has slaves in the numbers 6, 7, 8 times more than slaves that were brought to the United States, or what is now the United States, because it wasn't the United States then. It became the United States later, but as a colony, started as a colony of Britain, and then later on the United States of America. And so we'll get into that. But when we look at the things that we have had to endure as a people, when looking at it from the context of African-American history, and I will talk about some diasporic things, a diaspora, the African diaspora. When you hear that term, that is about people of African descent all over the world. The diaspora will be all over the world. So I'm gonna have to talk about some of that in order to understand some things, because slavery did not start here. Slavery was a concept that was going on all over the world. But I will show you that slavery in America was unlike any other slavery in the world. And so the challenge that we have when we're attempting to understand slavery, we cannot talk about slavery in general terms and then apply what the things that happen in this country when we talk about slavery in general. If you do that, then you miss some things, because American slavery was unlike any other slavery around the world. And so we'll get into that. We'll talk about some differences. We may even get into some of that today. I'm not sure. I'm going to create a hard stop at 8 o'clock so that we can have time to digest some things coming into next week. And I also want to encourage you, if you have questions, you can go on to the Lessons in African American History page on Facebook. There is a Lessons in African American History page on Twitter as well. And so, but if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chats. This particular lesson is being live streamed on the Lessons in African American History page. So if you type in Lessons in African American History, you'll find that page. I think the link, the image that you'll see is Black History Matters. And you'll see some other earlier posts that have been made. This is an incredible opportunity for us to begin to stream more content to that page and to really delve into an understanding of our history. There's some things that I'm going to be looking to do technologically here. I won't do it today, but I will be looking to put up some imagery of some things that I would like for you all to see when I'm talking about different places around the world. And I'll bring some of that into the lesson on next week. And so my prayer as it relates to this class is that no matter whoever watches, no matter their race, their color, their ethnicity, no matter where they originated from, either this country or another, that this class will help all of us to gain a better understanding of African-American people in America, all people. This is not a class that is designed only for African-American people, because and I believe in the same way that we all should know American history or world history, we should all know African-American history as well. And so I want to encourage you to invite others, but I also want to encourage you to engage in dialogue that is productive. That unfortunately, there's some very charged topics, but because those topics are charged topics, we have to engage them because they are indeed the history. The history is what it is. You can disagree with it, but you can't change it. It is what it is. The goal of understanding our history is to be better, is to learn from the good and the bad, the ugly and the pretty, so that we can do better, I believe, as a country, as a people, as we relate to one another and others. The goal is that we come out of this with a better understanding of who we are. If you are African-American, hopefully other individuals in other cultures will gain a better understanding into us as well. But I say us, but that's even a challenging topic, because just because our skin is darker does not make all of us the same. You can see it even in your experiences now. I live in Georgia, but I'm from Chicago. And there are some cultural things that are part of who I am that are connected to where I grew up and who my family is and where I went to school, the choices that I've made, all of those things. When I come down here, there are people whose decisions and choices and upbringing and all those things are different. There are different things culturally in Georgia than they were in Chicago, where I grew up. But I'll tell you, one of the great things that happened to me when I was in college is one of our professors in my freshman year told us, they said, listen, you're going to learn all of these things about history, but many people will leave college and not know their own history. And so one of the things that we had to do our freshman year is we had to write a paper on our family history. That my freshman year, as I was learning about the history of Africa and learning about the history of Africans in America and learning about American history, they made us learn about our own history. They told us, you walk in here with a piece of paper with a tree and some names on it, you're going to get an F. You got to go home and interview the oldest members of your family. Somebody in your family is going to be the keeper of all the pictures and all of those things. Find those individuals and learn as much as you can about your history. You're not going to be graded about how far back you can go, because some of you will hit some snags, but you will be graded on the quality of information that you're able to bring back and how you present that information, grammatically correct and all of those things. It's one of the best assignments that Morehouse ever gave me, because I was able to go back, fortunately for me, to slavery on both sides of my family. My family were slaves here in Georgia. So in many ways, it brings me back to some roots of our family here in Georgia on the Whitmore plantations and on the Curry plantations in Union Point, Georgia, which is out I-20 going towards South Carolina, and the Whitmore plantations on my mom's side in Marianna, Arkansas. On my father's side, the Curry plantations in Union Point, Georgia. on my mom's side, the Whitmore plantations in Marianna, Arkansas. And so with that, many of us who migrated, and we'll talk about migrations later and all that, and how we ended up leaving the South and ended up where we were around in other places around the country as well. There's a reason for how we ended up where we were and all of that. But at the end of the day, I encourage us to take all of this information, and my prayer is that we're able to engage in, again, constructive conversations, not destructive conversations. And my hope is that through the things that we learn, that you come out of it with an appreciation for the work that our ancestors did, number one, but number two, for an appreciation for what God did, even in the midst of all of the challenges that we faced. And I truly believe that God was in the midst. I don't believe God did it, but I believe God was in the midst working on our behalf. And so with that, let's go to the continent of Africa and talk about a couple of things, because one of the things I want us to come out of this with is an appreciation for some incredible things that were going on in Africa before we ended up on what is now the United States of America, or in what would become the United States of America. If you're taking notes, and I hope you are, I want you to write down a couple countries, a couple empires, I'll call them. It's probably the better way to talk about them. I want you to write down the Empire of Ghana, Ghana, the Empire of Mali, Mali, and the Empire of Songhai, Song, like song, and then Hay, Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. You can also write down Egypt, because I may have to talk about Egypt a little bit too. Matter of fact, I will. And then I want you also to write down a culture group called the Berbers, Berber. I want you to write down that culture group called the Berbers. They were a nomadic group of individuals who took and trained on a lot of different things. A lot of the things that we learned about iron smelting in Africa, a lot of things that we learned about war-making materials and things like that, it came from the Berbers, who were a nomadic people traveling around. But I also want to let you know that African people were very cosmopolitan. They were not restricted to the continent of Africa. A lot of African traders had moved around much of what would have been called the known world. There's a book that you can write down the title. It's called They Came Before Columbus. They Came Before Columbus. The author's name is Ivan van Sertima. And he argues and he shows evidence of an African presence in what is now the Americas, North and South America, that predated Columbus's discovery. I put those in quotation marks on purpose. That predates his discovery in 1492. It's hard to discover something when someone's already there. And what I would argue is that he does discover it, but he discovers it for Europeans. He doesn't discover it, of course, for the natives who are already here. And many would argue he doesn't discover it for Africans who had already been here, influencing other groups, Aztecs and the Mayans and other native culture groups that were here as well. Many of you know the story that they get the name Indians because Columbus thought he was in India, because they did not know that there was this massive landmass. He was looking for an all-waterway, leaving Europe, traveling west back to India. And when he reached that landmass, he thought that's where he was. And so they got the name Indians. But Ivan van Sertima would argue that by the time Columbus got here, Africans had already been here. This would be in 1492, of course, it predates slavery. And so Africans were trading and sailing all over the known world, around the Mediterranean. I'll show you those in maps later. and to the countries around Spain and others. But through this, it led to other things. So I want to read a couple things and then I will talk about them. The couple books that I'm using today that I told you, one that would be the primary book that I would use is John Hope Franklin and Alfred Moss's From Slavery to Freedom. From Slavery to Freedom. This book, I believe, is the 7th edition, potentially the 8th edition, the 7th edition. This is the 7th edition of John Hope Franklin and Alfred Moss's book. And then the other book that I chose to bring in today is called To Make Our World Anew, Volume 1, A History of African Americans. And this book goes to 1880. It's by two professors, Robin Kelly and my mentor, Earl Lewis. This book is called To Make Our World Anew. It is an edited volume of various professors in the field who wrote on different topics on African-American history up to 1880. The first chapter in that book is by the author Colin Palmer. He writes about the first passage from 1502 to 1619. 1619 is critical because that is the date that is generally credited when the first Africans land on the shores of America. That would later on usher in the African slave trade to America, because there is an African slave trade that is already going on that predates the slave trade to America. I will also show you later that when the first Africans come here, they don't come here as slaves in the same way that we would think of slavery when you watched a movie years ago, like Roots and the things that you would have saw in that movie. And then some things about that movie, not that it's inaccurate, because it's not, but what you saw in that movie would not have been the norm across the South. I would also show you later that there's slavery in the North as well. It just ends earlier than it does in the South, but that's a lesson for another time. But allow me to read something from Colin Palmer's first chapter in this book, the first passage from 1502 to 1619. He says, Black Africans were brought as slaves into the Caribbean islands and the mainland colonies of Central and South America, first by the Spaniards and later by the Portuguese. Beginning in 1502, the slave trade gathered momentum as white colonists came to rely on this forced Black labor. It says, during the early years of the trade, Africans passed through Spain, where many remained, to the Americas. And by 1518, however, a direct route from Africa to the Americas was introduced. Notice he said to the Americas, not to what we now know as North America or to what we now know as the United States of America, but the Americas, North and South America, and all of those little small islands in between is what he's talking about there, because slavery, the traffic in slaves would start in those areas first. It says, not all Africans in the Americas, even in the 16th century, which would have been the 1500s, served as slaves for the duration of their lives. That's important because many of you, when you were going to school, you heard of a term, they called it indentured servitude. We learned it as many Europeans would come over, and in exchange for passage to the New World, they would indenture themselves to whoever brought them over and paid passage for them to come over. They would indenture themselves for a period of up to 7 years. And then once that 7-year indenture ended, they would get land and seeds and the ability to start their own community of land. They could grow their own food. But in exchange for that passage to the New World, as it was called, they would indenture themselves for a period generally of up to 7 years. And so, much like what he says here, not all Africans in the Americas, even in the 16th century, served as slaves for the duration of their lives. That many of them, it says, managed to achieve their freedoms, and others were born here free. It says in 1617, the first town or settlement controlled by free blacks in the Americas was established in Mexico. There was a settlement of free blacks that was established in Mexico. It says this was a major development in Black life in the Western Hemisphere. It was the first time that a group of Africans gained the right to live as free people. These pioneers had successfully thrown off the yoke of slavery through their own efforts, and these folk would be the ones who were setting the stage for an eventual liberation of other enslaved Africans. But almost 3 centuries passed before this goal would be accomplished everywhere in America. Notice that was 1617. It is 2 years after that, in 1619, after this free Mexican town in San Lorenzo de los Negros is what it was called. It received this charter. In 1619, though, 20 Africans disembarked from a Dutch ship at Jamestown, Virginia. These people were the first African ship to the new and permanent settlement that the English colonists had established in North America. They came 117 years after Africans were first enslaved in the Americas in Hispaniola. So allow us to talk a little bit, though. Let's go backwards, because that's how we got here. But the question that we need to answer is, where did we come from? Where did we come from? We came from the continent of Africa. Even 117 years earlier, when those individuals were coming from or going into the Americas, rather, not all into what was, again, the United States, what would be eventually the United States of America. Let me just jump ahead for a second. I want to show you something just to give you some numbers, So there's been a lot of debates about how many Africans were taken off of the continent. No one would ever be able to give you that number accurately. And there's a couple of reasons why. Like the early slave trade didn't keep the best data. Some of the earliest slave trades didn't keep the best data. There were a lot of slaves early on that were being kidnapped off of the continent. There were others who were being moved because when you would get charters to, and I talk about this, you would get charters in order to move or to traffic in slaves. So the countries in Europe who were allowing this and were buying slaves would create charters for companies and countries. The Portuguese were the first ones, and the largest group early, and Lily early had a monopoly on the slave trade for several years. But they would get charters to move so many slaves, but they would pay taxes on the number of slaves that they moved. And so there was an underground market to traffic slaves to avoid the tax. And so, as you could imagine, if I'm illegally trafficking slaves, then I'm probably not keeping records of the work that I'm doing. And so it would be absolutely impossible to gain an accurate number, but there are estimates. And some conservative estimates would put that number somewhere between 10 to 12 million slaves or Africans. They were not slaves. They were forced into slavery. They didn't leave the continent of Africa as slaves, not all of them, because there's some nuances in that as well. But they don't all leave the continent of Africa as slaves. Some of them are literally kidnapped off of the continent and then taken to other parts of the world, not always to the New World, many times up to Portugal and Spain and other European nations. There's a book out there, you can write this title down, called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It talks about a lot of this. But the people who were being stripped from their homelands came from incredible places. Many of us were taught that these slaves were split up and you'd have different culture groups that were put together so they couldn't communicate. That was true in some cases, but in other cases, people were brought from varying culture groups into the same location because of a skill set they brought to that location. Angola would have been one. And we'll talk about that when we get to the continent of Africa, where people were brought from certain parts of Africa. For example, along the coast, there were a lot of rice growers on the coast of Africa. And they took them to the coast of America where they grew rice. And so in certain parts of the country, you would have African slaves from the same place doing work now in the continent of Africa. I mean, in the New World, rather, in the same place because of the skill set that they brought. They knew how to grow rice on the west coast of Africa, and now they're growing rice on the east coast in America, or in the east coast of the New World. And so there is a truth to a partial truth that in some instances they were put in places where they couldn't communicate, but in other places they were in areas where they all could communicate because they were coming over from the same areas. But where were they coming from? So let's talk a little bit about this empire of Ghana that I told you about. It says the first West African state, I'm pulling this one from John Hope Franklin's book. The first West African state of which there is any record is Ghana, which lay about 500 miles northwest of its modern namesake. So if you go to a map of Africa now, and you find Ghana in West Africa, 500 miles northwest of what is present day Ghana would have been the Ghana that we're talking about now. The capital of Ghana was Kumbi Saleh. It says although its accurately recorded history does not antedate the 7th century, so in the 600s, the history that we have, the recorded history that we have does not go back that far. It says there is evidence that Ghana's political and cultural history extends back perhaps into the very early Christian era, that it would extend back even further, that there is evidence, cultural evidence, that the history extends back even further. The earliest observations of Ghana were made when it was a confederacy of settlements extending along the grasslands of the Senegal into the upper Niger, and its boundaries were not well defined, and doubtless they were changed with the fortunes of the kingdom. So as the kingdom's fortunes changed, they expanded or contracted, depending on the fortunes of the kingdom and how well it was doing. It says most of the public offices were hereditary, which meant it traveled from inside of a family. And the tendency was for the stratified social order to become solidified. So there were the social order was pretty solid. You know, people of higher culture stayed there, and people of lower economic, not culture, but economic stayed there. So it was a pretty solidified hereditary structure and socially. But the people of Ghana enjoyed prosperity as farmers until a series of droughts came and extended the deserts into their area. But as long as they were able to carry on their farming, gardens and date groves dotted the countryside, and there was an abundance of sheep and cattle in the outlying areas. They were a trading people. Their chief town, or their capital city of Kumbi Saleh, was an important commercial center during the Middle Ages. And by the beginning of the 10th century, the Muslim influence from the East was present. The capital city had a native and an Arab section. So you had some people who had converted to Islam. You had others who did not. Arabs had come and moved into the area, and you had natives and Arabs that are now there in their communities, and people were gradually adopting the religion of Islam. Now, not everybody did not adopt it, but people were adopting the religion of Islam as Islamic traders were coming from the East and moving across the continent. They're influencing people with their religion and their trade, and there are people who are converting to Islam as these Islamic traders are moving along from the East into these Western empires, and all of them that I will talk about were influenced by Islam during this period. So the prosperity that came as these Arabs were beginning to come in increased the power of Ghana, and its influence was extended in all directions. And by the 11th century or the 1000s, when the king had become a Muslim, Ghana could boast of a large army and a lucrative trade across the desert. From the Muslim countries came wheat and fruit and sugar. From across the desert came caravans laden with textiles and brass and pearls and salt. Salt at the time would have been a preservative for food. Ghana, and so salt was a very important trade item, very not only important, but a lucrative trade item. And so salt was you can make a lot of money trading in salt because salt was a preservative. So Ghana exchanged ivory and slaves and gold from Bambuhu for these commodities. The king, recognizing the value of this commercial trade, imposed a tax on imports and exports and appointed a collector to look after his interests. Under the rulers of the Sis dynasty, Ghana reached the heights of its power. Tribes as far north as Tachit in present Mauritania paid tribute to the king of Ghana. And while in the south, its influence extended to the gold mines of the Faleme and the Bambouk. It was the yield from these mines that supplied the coffers of the Sis dynasty with the gold used in the trade with Moroccan caravans. In the faraway Cairo, back into Egypt now, and the Baghdad, Ghana was a subject of discussion among commercial and religious groups. That the kingdom of Ghana was a very powerful kingdom in West Africa at this time, and was a subject of discussion among commercial and religious groups and in the known world. And so that's one country. I could go into more. What led to the downfall of Ghana, again, I talked about the droughts that would affect their growing, the farming and the gardens is one of the things that led to its downfall economically. But then as the downfall started to happen and the country or the empire began to weaken, it began to get attacked by growing empires. And one of those would have been Mali. By the end of the 11th century, Ghana entered a period of economic decline brought by a series of droughts that dried up the important Ouagadougou and Bagana districts. And under such trying circumstances, it fell easy prey to the waves of conquerors who began to sweep through and destroy the kingdom during the 12th and 13th century. Now Mali. As Ghana began to decline, Mali began to rise. Mali, also called Mele or M-E-L-L-E, began as an organized kingdom in around 1235. But the nucleus of its political organization dates back to the beginning of the 7th century. So again, things that we know in the 1200s or the 13th century, there's evidence that this kingdom dated back 600-700 years earlier. But until the 11th century, it was a relatively insignificant kingdom. They called their kings Mansas, and its most famous king was Mansa Musa. He ruled from 1312 to 1337. He was an incredibly powerful king and an incredibly rich king too. His empire spanned across North Africa, and he could devote his attention to encouraging the industry of his people and also displaying the wealth of his kingdom. The kingdom of Mali was incredibly wealthy. The people of Mali were generally agricultural, but a substantial number of them, though, were able to engage in crafts and mining. Someone just put in there that he was one of the richest in the world, and he absolutely was. They had incredibly rich mines of Bure, and were now at their disposal, and these mines served to enrich their coffers. So he eventually would convert to Islam, and as an Islamic king, if they're able, they all are supposed to make at least a pilgrimage to Mecca. And the best information about the period that affords the level of attainment of this particular kingdom comes from the account of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca. The king, who was newly converted to the religion of Islam, was ardent and pious, and as good Muslims, they look forward to making that traditional pilgrimage, as I said earlier, to Mecca. This pilgrimage was an excellent opportunity for him, though, to display the wealth of the kingdom and to attract more trade. Because in order to continue to build your kingdom, you want to make money through trade. You want to take the things that you have, trade for the things that you need in order to continue to build out your kingdom. And his pilgrimage to Mecca was an opportunity for him to do that. His pilgrimage in 1324 exceeded all visits to Mecca by previous royal figures from the West. Cairo's El Amari said that the entourage was composed of thousands of people, a large portion of which constituted Mansa Musa's military escorts. Gifts were lavished on the population everywhere he went, and mosques were built wherever they were needed. As the camels approached Mecca, their burden, because he had put so much money, gold and riches and other things that he was trading on these camels, as they approached Mecca, he says, their burden was considerably lighter than it had been when they departed from the east. So when they, on their trek from the west to the east, he's lavishing his population of people who are a part of his kingdom. He's taking care of them. It is an incredible show of wealth and power that he had amassed. This was an incredibly powerful kingdom of Mali. And the most famous of the Mansas was Mansa Musa. Under Mansa Musa and its successor, Suleiman, they enjoyed a flourishing economy with good, watch this, international trade relations, and could point with pride to a stable government extending several hundred miles from the Atlantic to Lake Chad. The people adhered to a state religion that had international connections, and learning flourished in the many schools that had been established. I wanted to talk about some of this, and we're going to stop and we'll talk about Songhai on next week. But I wanted to talk about this because there is this idea about Africa as a bunch of uneducated people who are simply waiting for history to happen to them. But that is not at all the case. Africa, number one, it is the richest continent in the world. It is the largest continent in the world. And if you study the history, what you'll find is that a lot of the things that the world knew was because of what they were learning from Africa, to include Europe. And when I talk about Egypt, you'll see, we're going to talk about a little bit of that. because a lot of Greek history, a lot of those Greeks came into Africa and then went back to Greece. A lot of those Europeans in the known world went into Africa, African schools, and began to learn from Africans, and then went back to their countries with information that they had learned from Africa. And the incredible thing about it, the thing that's different about them and us today, is that Europeans at that time, earlier, did not have issues, particularly with Egypt, and there's some nuances to this, with what was going on and the information and the knowledge and all of that information that they were getting. In some places, they did not look at African people as inferior to them. Now that changes, it changes, and it changes as they look for ways to justify what they eventually begin to do to African people. That comes later. They would use race as a means of justifying what they were doing. We're going to learn a little bit, when I talk about this, a little bit of nuances to that, when you look at the slavery that is happening with the Spaniards, it's a little bit different. But when you talk about the Greeks and the folk in that area, it's a little bit different. But the Spaniards, their perception of African people is a degraded perception much earlier than for some of these others. But for others, they're going into Africa, gaining the knowledge that Africa provides, taking it back to their countries, and asking a different sets of questions with that information, and it leads them into different places. And we'll talk about some of that later as well. But I wanted to hit on some things so that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more on next week, because the continent of Africa, schools, empires, economies, militaries, structures that were very advanced for their time, not just for Africans, but for the world. Because some of the periods that we're talking about now, when Africa was on the ascent, on the rise, Europe was in the 1400s, was in a period of what we would call the Dark Ages, where there was not a lot of schools and education. As a matter of fact, education was frowned upon, and a lot of the thinkers were escaping into Africa, where education was not being frowned upon, and gaining information in Northwest and Northeast Africa and the Northern African parts of the world. And so, and then they would go back and then use a lot of that information to advance their own countries and their own political empires as well. So a lot of what we've learned, the things and the images that they showed us when we were growing up of Tarzan, and a lot of these cultures that were not advanced. Now, not every culture was advanced in Africa, just like not every culture in Europe was advanced. But there were very advanced cultures in Africa that many of these individuals were stripped from their countries, kidnapped from their countries, and we'll talk about that in more detail, because not everybody was kidnapped. There was slave trade, and there were slaves being traded by Africans in Africa, trading other Africans into slavery. But I say that, and let me nuance that for you, because the concept of Africa as people, as one Africa, is a very new, recent concept. People in Africa during the period that we're talking about would not have seen themselves as African. They would have seen themselves as Ashanti or Benin or Igbo or Dahomey or Hausa. They would have seen themselves in their culture group. And if I'm an Ashanti, I'm not an Igbo. If I'm an Ashanti, I'm not a Hausa. And so the Ashanti, if they were at war with another culture group, and those Africans that would have been enslaved or that would have been captured in war, if I'm an Ashanti, those are not my people. And so the Europeans would come over and trade in weaponry and guns and gunpowder and other foodstuffs, and they would trade in exchange for slaves. Well, if I'm an Ashanti at war with another culture group and I capture slaves from another culture group, turning them over to Europeans for gunfight, for gunpowder and weapons and other things to continue my fight against those culture groups would not have been seen from them of enslaving another African person. They would have not have seen themselves that way. So when people make the argument that says slavery wasn't that bad because Africans sold other Africans into slavery, it is an academic, dishonest way of talking about what was going on the continent of Africa. What was actually happening, now there were long-standing wars between culture groups. Europeans would come over and exploit those differences. I'll give you the gunpowder and the weapons you need to win. All I want you to do is whatever group of people you capture, if you'll give them to us, we'll continue to supply you with the weapons you need to win. And then another European country would go and supply the other group, and that would be the arrangement as well. And so if I'm fighting the Ashanti, I'm not an Ashanti. And so if I capture an Ashanti, I'm not giving my own people to these Europeans. Ashantis would not give an Ashanti to them. But other culture groups, they absolutely would have. And so it's a more nuanced conversation when we talk about slavery. And what you'll find also is when people in Africa, many cultures, when they begin to find out what was actually happening in the Americas, there were African folk who were creating anti-slavery groups in Africa to try to fight against what was actually happening. Because what I said to you, remember what I said to you, that slavery in America was unlike any other slavery in the world. Because even in Africa, a person that was enslaved was a part of, could still be a part of the culture, that slavery was not always a life sentence. Slavery was not inherited by your children. If you converted, if you were in Islam, if your enslaver, if you will, was Islamic and you converted to Islam, they would free you because you could not enslave your brother in Islam. And so in America, it was very different. As a matter of fact, when the whole discussion of conversion started in this country, many enslavers would not proselytize slaves because they felt that they had confessed Christianity, they may have to release them. But decisions were made that you can proselytize them, but if they convert to Christianity, they would just be a Christian slave. I will very deliberately use the term enslaver and not master, and not slave master, because I think the term gives a lot more credit than what the credit that's due. Enslaver, I believe, is the better term to use. And so they were enslavers, and they pulled these folk from their continent, took them across the water, and used them, and many times very harshly, not always harshly, physically harsh, but I would argue that slavery in any form, forced servitude in any form, on its face is harsh. But others, in addition to the harshness of simply being enslaved against your will, had to endure incredibly harsh situations. So we're going to talk about that. Some things that happened in the slave trade that started on the continent, particularly when they begin to go inland and then had to take the trek to the coast, and a lot of the challenges then the challenges on the coast in prisons that were being built to hold them until ships would arrive to move them. And then the incredible cruelty of the Middle Passage. We'll talk about what that is and what the Middle Passage actually means. And then once they get off the boats in the New World, a whole new set of cruelty. But allow me to end this particular session like this. And I will say this multiple times as we go through this class, because I don't want this class to be a sad class, because it should not be. That while there are incredible hurdles, incredible challenges that our people had to overcome and endure, you are here today because they overcame and they endured. We'll talk about the Middle Passage. We'll talk about the harshness of what happened on the continent, from inland treks to the coast, and what happened on the coast, and what happened in the whole of those ships, and what happened in the New World. But I will, if you write this down, write it this way: I am a product of those who refused to die. I am a product of those who refused to die. There were some who died because they were sick. There were some who died because they were killed. There were some who died because they jumped overboard on the ships. There were some who died or committed infanticide because they didn't want their children to endure the hardships. But you are a product of those who refuse to give up, who refuse to quit, who refuse to die. And because they decided to continue to fight, I will encourage you to continue to fight as well. We honor their struggle and we honor their fight by continuing to fight. And my hope is, as I close this particular message tonight, I hope there was something here that gave you something that we all learned here. Even every time I read something, more things I pull out. There's some things that I pulled out of some of the things that I was studying to prepare for tonight. That's the thing I love about history. You never stop learning. And so, but I do want to encourage you that as you come each week, come with a pencil and paper or a pen and paper to take notes, because I will always cite the books, cite the sources, give you things to pull out. And then in subsequent lessons, I'll put up some imagery up on the screen as well. There's a couple maps and things that I want you to see, because when we start talking about in some detail about some of the slave trading countries and where slaves went and all of that, what you'll find is that there were many European nations that were complicit in the trade of African people all over the world, all up into Europe and into the Americas as well. And so that book that I mentioned, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, it is one of the way, this is one of the things that they talk about. And so with that, let's see, it is 8:15. I said I had a hard stop at 8 and I went over 15 minutes, but I got started a little bit late. But I'll stop there. If there's anything that you enjoyed or learned about this lesson, I encourage you, like our Lessons in African American History page, please go in and put that information in the chat, and I would love to engage you there. If you have questions, put those in the chat as well. And I would love to use the Lessons in African American History page as we do these lessons to engage in further conversation during the week as we come into each of these lessons every Monday. Every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Central Time. And I look forward to engaging in these lessons each week.